So far on SQETV, we've analysed a number of multiple choice questions that are in the SRA's question bank. Some are quite short questions with relatively short scenarios, but others have quite lengthy options to choose from. And indeed, in this video, we're going to have a look at a question where the options are quite lengthy and need quite a lot of analysis. So stay tuned, but only after the jingle.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQETV?
So as I said a few moments ago, I'm going to have a look at this MCQ. I'm going to do it against the clock, and we're going to see how I get on. Full analysis to follow. So 3, 2, 1, eyes down. The testator dies and his executor is considering the terms of his will. The will contains the following clause: I give free of tax the sum of £20,000 to my niece, provided that she shall attain the age of 18 years. So it's clearly a wills question. There's a legacy of £20,000. It's conditional on the niece attaining 18 years. Okay, the residual estate is given to the testator's civil partner who survives the testator. The niece died intestate at the age of 23 years before the testator. She was survived by her husband and only child, a son who is aged 3. The niece's estate was £6,000 net. So I suspect this question is going to be about whether or not the gift to the niece lapses and what happens to it. So let's see what the question is. Am I right in that front? Let's have a look. So the question's telling us which of the following statements provides the best advice to the executor regarding the legacy to the niece? A. The legacy of £20,000 will form part of the niece's estate, will pass to her husband under her niece's intestacy. That's wrong. The legacy will lapse because the niece predeceased the testator, which means that the legacy never vested in her estate. So clearly A is wrong. B, we can rule that out as well because it says at the beginning the legacy will form part of the niece's estate. We've ruled that out already. And in fact, C is the same, applies again. The legacy of £20,000 won't form part of the niece's estate, so we can rule out C. So we'll have to choose between D and E. D, the legacy of £20,000 will fail and will pass to the testator's civil partner as part of the residuary estate. That's got to be right. The gift is going to lapse. In other words, it's going to fail because there's no substitute gift that's been given in the terms of the will. So therefore, what happens with legacies is that when they fail, they fall into the residuary estate. We've got a residuary beneficiary, and therefore, yeah, it will go to that the civil partner because they're named as the beneficiary of the residue. So hopefully we can rule out E. E says the legacy of £20,000 will fail. Well, we know that's correct. So hopefully the second bit's wrong, and will pass under the testator's partial intestacy. No, there's no partial intestacy here. The testator is able to fully distribute the estate because we've got a residuary beneficiary who survived the testator. That's the civil partner. So yeah, D is definitely the right answer.
SQETV.
Now you'll notice that I answered this question in much longer than the average time it takes to answer a multiple choice question on the SQE1 paper. Remember, it's 1 minute 42 seconds on average you need. Now I did that partly because I decided to take this question a little slower because there was quite a lot involved and I wanted to make sure I unpacked all the facts. But it goes to show that even somebody who's very expert in these areas needs sometimes to spend a little longer. I think in fairness, by my articulating some of my thoughts, that would have taken longer than the thought process to think it through. But I suspect under test conditions, if I was just thinking through, I would have spent close to, if not slightly more, than the time allocated to the question because there's quite a lot to unpack, particularly in the fact that the options were quite lengthy and I needed to distinguish between them. Even so, I managed to take shortcuts by eliminating B and C quite quickly once eliminated A, because if you remember, it says the legacy will form part of the niece's estate in all three of those answers. And we worked out that it wouldn't do because the niece did not survive the testator. And this is critical. Where a legacy is granted or given in a will, it will fail, it will lapse if the beneficiary predeceases the testator. It never forms part of the second deceased, in this case the niece's estate, and therefore you have to look if there's a substitute gift. There was no substitute gift here, and therefore it would end up, that £20,000 would end up forming part of the residue of the estate. And there was no partial intestacy there, so E was wrong because we had a named individual as the residuary beneficiary who was the civil partner of the testator. So it was quite easy to see how we got to the answer which we did, the correct one, which was D, and I've checked the answer, so good news, that is the right answer.
SQETV.
Now, although you ruled out options A and B quite quickly because of the first 11 words, we concluded that the legacy would lapse, as we've just mentioned. It's worthwhile just looking at what happened on the niece's death, even though that's not relevant to the fact pattern of this particular case. Why? Well, in a slightly different question on a very similar fact pattern, you may have been left to choose between options A and B. You weren't in this case, but let's just see what happened to the niece's estate in anything that did pass under her estate. What happened to that £6,000? Well, it all would have passed to the husband, because although she left a surviving son, the estate was so small that under the intestacy rules, the whole of that £6,000 would have gone to the surviving spouse. However, in more substantial estates, there is a split between the surviving spouse and the issue, but that wouldn't have been relevant here because the estate was so small.
SQETV.
The last bit of analysis of the options I just want to share with you is in relation to option C, which mentioned that the £20,000 would form part of the niece's estate and would be held on trust for her son under Section 33 of the Wills Act. Now, of course, we ruled out the first part of that answer for the same reasons we ruled out A and B. But what if that statement had been correct? Would Section 33 apply? Well, the answer is no. Let's remind you what Section 33 provides. It's the per stirpes rule. That provides that where a testator leaves a gift to their direct issue, in other words, a son, daughter or grandchild or great-grandchild and so on, direct issue, and that beneficiary predeceases the testator, leaving issue themselves, then they take by way of substitution. However, it doesn't apply to less direct descendants, so it doesn't apply to nieces and nephews and so on. So that's why Section 33 doesn't apply on these facts, because the testator left the £20,000 to his niece, and therefore there's no substitute gift by way of operation of law. If you're appreciating this content, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe to the channel and tap that notification bell up there, because if you do that, you'll find out as soon as our new videos drop. And it would really help us get ahead of the algorithm and make sure that as much of this content can be delivered to people that need it if you leave a comment in the chat as well. Let us know what other questions you might want us to cover in the SRA's sample questions. That might be something that would help you, but also your fellow skewers, SQETV viewers as we call you. So let's go and have a look at the various what if scenarios, but only after we've taken a look at the summary of the law that was covered by this question. So to answer this question correctly, what you needed to do was to have an appreciation of when a gift will lapse or fail, and then what happens when it does fail. And if it's a legacy like it was in this case, you'll know that it will fall into the residue of the estate unless there is a substitute gift. And you need to know the rules in relation to substitute gifts, and in particular how to apply Section 33 of the Wills Act in the event that there isn't a substitute gift, and apply that per stirpes rule. But of course, on the facts of this case, it wasn't relevant because the gift was not to the testator's daughter, it was to his niece. So, as we always do when we finish an SQETV video, I'm going to leave you with a number of what-if scenarios, some alternative fact patterns which might come up in the exam, because let's face it, you're not going to be asked an identical question, or at least one with a very similar fact pattern. So, what-if scenario number one? What if the gift which lapsed was to the testator's daughter rather than to his niece, and that daughter had predeceased the testator, leaving her husband and infant son? Alternatively, what would have happened if the testator had died intestate without leaving a will, and the testator's niece had predeceased him, leaving her husband and infant son, with no other close relatives of the testator surviving? Alternatively, what would have happened if the testator's niece was the sole beneficiary of the testator's estate by way of his will, but she predeceased the testator, leaving her husband and infant son? And final what-if scenario, what if the testator's niece had actually survived the testator, but she died before the legacy from the testator could be paid to her? How would that have changed things? And as I always mention on these videos, we don't give you the answer, but if you go away and check your source notes from any good course that you've done, you should be able to find the answers to all of these questions. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't hesitate to come back to us soon. Our videos drop several times a week, so there's always stuff there to keep up to date with what's going on with the SQE, but also lots of revision materials to support your SQE journey. Until next time, cue the jingle.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQETV?